first entry and our first event in our series about collaboration in cybersecurity and why it's important and what we can do together to combat and protect ourselves and our businesses and our nations. For too long a time, success, both in business and in politics, has been viewed as something you achieve on your own. The view that your business can only succeed by defeating, outsmarting, and dominating the competition. In politics, politicians too often strive to achieve success for their party at all costs. And this very inward-looking view is hurting us today in cybersecurity. No one business or organization is an island. No one business benefits from its competitors being compromised through a data breach. Our industries suffer through these breaches. We lose consumer confidence. Our insurance premiums go up. And as a whole, it has long-term negative impacts for the lives of our customers. And there's a whole host of additional other negatives. Now, even back as early as 2008, I attended a closed forum here in London hosted by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And the whole topic was around the need for the public-private partnership and collaboration between the private sector and the private sector with the public sector in order to be successful in cybersecurity. And representatives from national security, national government, business leaders from across all business verticals came together and agreed this collaboration is absolutely essential in order to succeed in the cyberspace. Yet, fast forward to where we are today in 2020, and the collaboration that we're seeing is still very limited. It is ad hoc, and it is very manual. And it is leaving us all at a disadvantage in the space of cybersecurity. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Arno, Robbertse, the Chief Executive of ITC Secure. Today is our first event in our series that will be talking specifically around collaboration, what is happening, what could be happening, and what can you, within your business, do to drive that change going forward, to benefit both yourself and our communities around us. Some housekeeping for today. We have a 1-hour slot during which we will have some panel discussion initially. Please put your questions in using the question and answer feature in Zoom. We will keep an eye on those as we go through and pick some out. Alternatively, leave some time at the end to cover all your questions as well. So please do use that functionality. And as a quick reminder that our session is going to be recorded today, so we'll host it on our social media sites and our websites as well for sharing with other participants or any other contributions you wish to make. I'd like to welcome our two esteemed panelists joining us today. Mike Doyle from Recognex joins us. Recognex has been closely involved with the open banking since its beginning days in 2015 and has deep subject matter expertise in fraud and security in the digital payment sector. Specifically, Mike has nearly 25 years of experience of information systems design in the financial services sector and has spent the last 10 years working specifically with fintechs and banks, helping them design their customer-facing and regulatory security strategies. Hi, Mike. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Arno. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Joining us today from IronNet, we have Bill Swearingen. IronNet is a US-headquartered cybersecurity business that is centered on the need for collective defense and sophisticated machine learning and artificial intelligence to defend against global cyber attacks. Bill has 2 decades of experience in information security, cyber defense, and protecting critical infrastructure from advanced cyber threats. He has created, developed, and led enterprise-class teams in providing incident response, digital forensics, vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, and policy enforcement to large Fortune 150 corporations. Good afternoon, Bill. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Arno. Glad to be here.
Bill, perhaps if we then begin with your experience and what the team at IronNet are seeing from a geopolitical perspective, and perhaps some of that public-private information sharing and partnerships that you and the team at IronNet promote. What have you been seeing in the geopolitical threat space at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for that great introduction. So when I take a look at really the fintech and geopolitical nature as a whole, what we're seeing is a big seismic shift in the world of fintech. So when I think about the advent of the revised payment services directive in Europe, as you mentioned, global banking and cryptocurrencies, we're seeing a big shift in where data is being stored, how data is being accessed across our industry. What's interesting to me as I think through the new world, the new function, is we're seeing barriers to entry in the financial market coming down. Right, we're seeing that banks and payment companies are starting to directly expose customer data, customer account data to third parties. Right, we're seeing and potentially other fintech companies, peers, partners, maybe even competitors in some sort. Often it's done via APIs or other computer to computer sharing interfaces. But what's interesting to me is that as we've shifted into this new data classification and new data models, is that the risk is also shifting, right? So we're traditionally used to understanding exactly what our threat boundary looks like. We're used to understanding the risk to that threat boundary. Here's where my data is. Here's who's accessing my data. And now, in this new world, that has shifted from a direct relationship. This is my data. This is my customer, and we're shifting that over to third parties. And as I continue down that thought process, just trying to make sure I take in consideration, the risks to that. We're also undergoing a great scrutiny placed on us by our regulators, right? Really focusing in on our use of outsourcing partners, and even when I think about the topic today, we talk about supply chain risk. Definitely is increasing, in conversations, and we need to consider these our outsourcing partners and our supply chain risks as a new common threat, and we need to have specific strategies around that. As I think about the regulatory nature, I'm seeing more documentation needs, more and different changing risk assessments, the governance and controls that we place on our cloud environments and our outsourcing arrangements. They're increasing, they're changing, they're different, and we need to understand and learn how as an industry or as a corporation participating in a specific vertical such as fintech, how do we address those things? This really is an obvious problem to me, that as we start to become more cloud native, that fintech's firm, we're finding a delicate balance between being able to be agile and grow quickly, and still retain that adequate and proportionate focus on the risk, right? Because those risks have changed. So when I think about when I think about the outsourcing and cloud native scenarios where we have a governance of cloud security risk, often the impact on our teams changes dramatically, right? So we have the potential to consume more of our team's focus and effort and time away from the actual practice of cybersecurity. So actually going away from what we're traditionally doing, and more into ensuring that we are defining our expectations to our partners. And so to me, what this really stands out, and Arno, this goes to your earlier point, this really highlights to me the importance of collective insights, and early warnings of understanding what attacks are happening, what are the objectives of our adversaries, what are they targeting in our industry for us to better respond? I mean, so we're still going to need those traditional security mechanisms, and I certainly don't want to assert that we don't. And we're still going to need our same control frameworks in place, but we certainly need to focus to ensure that our threat intelligence strategy has a focus on collective defense, right? We need to leverage the experience of the entire fintech industry and potentially other industries as a whole to share that collective learnings and benefit together from early warnings.
Thank you, Bill. There's a couple of interesting things there that I'd like to pick up on, but perhaps Mike, if I put it to you. So what Bill described there is the rise of a next generation of companies born in the cloud, as some say, or I think Bill said cloud native. And we perceive from the outside that these companies have a great opportunity, an opportunity to build what is appropriate using new tools never in the past available in the cloud, and in doing so, build in security from the outset. We assume looking at, but is that a reality? And to what extent should these cloud native businesses, commonly known as a subcollective of fintechs, be thinking about or doing to collaborate in that space and learn from each other? Mike, I think we have you on mute.
Correct. Sorry. Yeah. So I think, the nature of fintechs is such that they're cloud native. They are designed to leverage the economies of scale of smaller tech providers, and they're a big part of their business case is being agile, being nimble, the ability to swap providers in and out at pace to help drive their business case. And I think, as Bill alluded, the problem that they now face is that the outsourcing arrangements are facing increasing scrutiny from regulators. So the EBA published their guidelines in 2019, and the guidelines looked focused on operational resilience, and on concentration risk specifically. So a big point was, are all the fintechs using a very small number of providers, or perhaps a single provider, to provide a single piece of functionality, which in itself has risk, but also part of the dilemma is that as a fintech, you have a very blinkered view. You can only see how well you're doing as an individual entity. Bill's right in saying that in that scenario, it makes perfect sense if you've got the ability to have a view that's consolidated and shared across multiple fintechs. In other words, where there's an element of concentration risk because you've got 2 or 3 providers in the marketplace. If then all the fintechs are have a single view on the performance of those providers, then what that allows you to do is it allows you to identify fairly quickly if there's a problem with one of those providers. So that's one reason why collective defense makes good sense, but also, again, as Bill mentioned, in the context of open banking, you have the notion of a single technology provider, which, although it's of low significance, which is a term that the EBA themselves use, it presents a systemic risk. So they provide a technology facility which, although in its own right it doesn't seem significant, if it was to fail, it would potentially prevent a systemic risk. So now what happens is these companies have to, the fintechs have to spend a disproportionate amount of time analysing and investigating this supply chain risk and continuously monitoring it. And at the same time, they're supposed to be continuously improving their cybersecurity and their resilience. And part of the problem then is when you get down into the shared responsibility element, i.e. what do you as a fintech have control over, and what does your infrastructure as a service provider or your platform as a service provider have control over, then it's absolutely essential that you are on top of what your shared responsibility is in terms of your security controls framework. Again, what that means is that if you're a fintech, you possibly got less than 100 staff. Being able to manage that risk is a full-time job, and it's a full-time job for a reasonable sized team. And that same team is probably the same team that's being tasked with the business as usual cybersecurity operations. So it's being forced to spread yourself very thin on the ground, because half of what you're doing is looking at being regulatory compliant, and the other half of what you're doing is effectively treading water, trying to keep up to speed with your agile business and to maintain the correct level of monitoring and governance across your security controls. So then it becomes even more important that you still, at the end of the day, that you still have a strong business as usual cybersecurity process. And part of the way of doing that is to not just understand how you as an individual company are doing, but to be able to benchmark yourself in the context of your other fintech peers, so that you can truly understand what good looks like.
And Mike, is there a platform or a forum that companies can go to do this currently? What comes to mind in the UK is the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK have launched some time ago now their CISP, Cybersecurity Information Sharing Platform, which is broadly about threat intelligence data being shared across different industries and verticals. Does that have an element of third party to it, or is there an alternative where companies can look to for guidance?
So it does. But I think the distinction here is that we're talking about the difference between the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. So part of what we're saying here is that to an extent, much of that information is post facto, so it's post event, and part of what we're saying is that you need to, as a company, you need to understand what good looks like in terms of, or what, sorry, not what good looks like, but what normal looks like in terms of your everyday business as usual activity. And then when you spot something that's not normal, that's abnormal, because you should be monitoring that on an ongoing basis, then if you can spot that in a timely fashion, then what you're doing is you're reducing the dwell time for cyber incidents. So although it's always good to be able to have post-facto access to that shared information, what we're arguing is that there's also an element of anticipatory monitoring that needs to take place so that you can understand from your own perspective what appears to be abnormal behaviour.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It's about the overall. It's about achieving cybersecurity maturity, and it's moving up that progress towards the right level of maturity for your business based on the risk that you face. You're very right that you say the NCSC CIS program is great, and at ITC we are very loud and proud supporters of it. But it is post-event, which that is wasted time, perhaps. And also it is manual. Us as a business need to identify what to share, log in, decide to share it. Others need to find the time to log in, analyze what we've put up there, and get value out of it. And so I think there's a lot to be said for doing that in a more automated fashion in order to accelerate even that post data, but as a step of improving our maturity to eventually being able to look at real time and going forward. I wonder, Bill, if you could say a little bit around what you, the team, and IronNet are thinking around real time network speed, sharing information, and collaboration between businesses.
Yeah, I feel like you just gave me a huge softball that I could, just talk for hours on. But I just want to first state, Mike, you're absolutely right, and Arno, that this is probably one of the biggest challenges, right? I think that most companies across all verticals really do understand the value of threat sharing. But Arno, what you just mentioned there is the problem, right? So right now it's very manual, and as an operational person, I have to decide how many of my resources am I going to dedicate to the sharing of threat intelligence or the analysis of intelligence that I've received, or versus responding or hunting in my own environment, right? And so this is a problem that we're looking to solve is how do we share relevant threat intelligence at machine speed. Now the thing, and just for those that have been on the front line, there's various types of threat intel. There can be atomic based indicators. These would be IPs, domains, hashes that can be very easily changed by an attacker, right? So when you're talking about threat intelligence that's post, that may not be of relevance, that we could be talking about an atomic indicator, right? So a domain, right? Or a file hash that could be easily changed. What we're really focused on right now is the sharing of behavioral type analytics, right? So what kind of TTPs is an attacker using in across your vertical? So if we see an attacker attacking financial services, their signature is their tools, tactics, and procedures that they're using, right? So that could be a type of a domain that they're registering. It could be their command and control channel that they're using. It could be the protocols that they're using or the tools that they're leveraging. That remains constant regardless of their target, right? And having a machine understand that rather than having a person do that is the future of security, right? We can understand there's several frameworks out there that describe the attacker's their tool set, and being able to detect and respond to those in our environment, but letting our tools do that so that we can prioritize and assign the more the more critical incidents to our people to address. Hopefully I hit that, Arno.
No, I think that's exactly right, Bill. It's about three things there, really. To touch on Mike's point, it needs to look at behavior. So not just a list of known bad things, but also looking for those unknown unknowns, which we do through advanced threat detection tools that look at deviations of behavior or deviations from a pattern of behavior. And the second point is the sharing in an automated fashion. So needing that to happen at machine speed, machine to machine. But then the critical part is how do we achieve this across different companies? Mm-hmm. How do we get different companies to collaborate in this way? How can they practically begin to think about achieving that?
So I think the first thing that needs to happen is is recognition. So recognition that there is a value in collaboration. And fortunately, that is happening, and it's being encouraged. So for instance, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK is starting to experiment with bringing companies together to collaborate. So there's definitely opportunity there, and it's being encouraged by the authorities, by the regulators. But then the second point is that it requires a degree of trust between companies, because obviously companies are very precious about their IP. Often that IP, that technology stack, is part of their value proposition, the way they've composed different partner organizations, and they don't want that information in the public domain. And one way that we can obviously work around that is via the process of anonymization. So one of the ways that we can approach this is to say, okay, well, let's get a group of companies together, and let's anonymize them, but then let's benchmark them against each other. And there are a number of benefits to doing that. By allowing companies to understand how many security incidents they have compared to an anonymous peer group, it's a really valuable insight, because not only does that tell you how well you as an individual organization are performing, but also it may well provide certain indications of whether perhaps your company is being specifically targeted out for cyber attacks. So could it be that somewhere on the dark web somebody has identified you as having, a comparatively weaker security approach, and that might be why you're getting, maybe 3, 4, 5 times as many security incidents as your peer group, because somebody has advertised the fact that maybe you're a soft touch. So by being able to, not only do you gain the benefit of having umbrella intelligence sharing, which effectively gives you an early warning system, but the added benefit of then being able to have some indication of your interest or perceived capability from third parties is also really important.
I want to jump in there if I can as well.
Sure.
And I would also, so I do think that the first step, Mike, I completely agree, is understanding the value. But then I would say that the second step would be designing a strategy of operationalize what you're already receiving, right? So and Mike, just hearing you talk, I'm sure that you've had this experience as well. As all threat intelligence isn't perfect, right? So in fact, it very, very rarely is, right? And so you need to have a strategy in your company of what type of information am I currently receiving, right? And how do I make use of that information right now without having to make any significant changes, in my process, or whatever. So one of the first things that I usually do is depending on the type of information that you're receiving. Let's go back to that domain and IP and file hash indicator sharing, whether you're getting it through CISP or however you're getting it. But putting that on a gray list, right? Looking for, we want to see if this is occurring in my environment. I did not say block, right? Let's see if this is occurring in my environment first, right? And then if it does hit, you can, and almost kind of goes right back to Mike, what you were saying. You can start to get a good sense of the value of the indicators that you're receiving. Is this source valid, right? Is this source proactively detecting things that I otherwise wouldn't have seen? Or is this stuff that I've seen in the past, right, that I've already responded to? And you can really start to get a good sense of that threat intelligence type. But then next would be, it would also identify where you need to improve, right? So yep, if you've got a good sense of those atomic indicators, or perhaps let's just stay with network. What if I receive a file hash? Do I have the capability of detecting this in my environment? Yes or no, right? Do I have the ability to detect behavioral type analytics? Yes or no? And it really can help hone you into deciding where you need to improve your detections going forward.
You're right, and that's really important what you're saying, Bill. So do you actually have the capability to use that intelligence if it's given to you? And that in some ways is dependent on your maturity as an organization. So it's great if that information is available to use, but actually it requires a certain level of capability and maturity in order to be able to integrate it in the first place. So then the other part, to your point, is helping companies to understand how they reach that level of maturity where they can then start to act on those real-time or near real-time pieces of information.
Absolutely.
So the question I have for the panel is why are we still here to talking about the need for collaboration? Why was I in a talk in 2008 promoting it and saying we need it? In the cyber incidents that we investigate and unravel, recently it's become increasingly clear the level of collaboration and effectively project management that goes into a cyber attack. These bad actors collaborate, they come together to combine either technical exploits or vulnerability in the company or delivery mechanisms. And we can see that in some of the code we reverse engineer, that they actually collaborate and they comment and they work together. So the bad actors are collaborating to our detriment. Yet we all seem to agree that we need to collaborate better, but we aren't doing it. So is that because every CISO of every fintech out there wants to collaborate, but it's being held back by the risk management team or by the CEO for fear of giving away competitive edge? Or is it lack of resources? Is it lack of focus? I'd like to get a view from the panel, please.
I'll take a first stab at that. So I certainly don't think it's a lack of support from the executives. Where I stand on this issue is that, and I've already stated this once, but I do believe that organizations recognize the value of sharing threat intel, right? And I hope, right? So, and I hope that we've kind of moved past that spot where it gives competitive edge. I'm sure that there's still some places where that's occurring, but you don't have to give away IP, right? And competitive edge with sharing threat intel. I believe that the industry as a whole, Arno, just to your point, I feel like we're trying to do the right thing. We're setting up sharing groups. We're setting up capabilities. But where I see the most common obstacle is that humans are still a part of the threat intelligence sharing workflow, right? I think that is our biggest problem. So, if you take a look at security and Mike, you said it perfectly earlier, you're dealing with, limited resources. If you're a company of 100 people, how many people are you going to dedicate to sharing the fact that you experienced a breach or a security incident with your peers, right? Versus actually going and reacting to that security issue, right? And then after the fact, most of the time there's another fire that we got to go after, and we've kind of caught ourselves in this loop where we need to get people out of the equation. This needs to be we need to have a more automated system to be able to do this.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think part of the problem as well is just a lack of awareness. So I think if companies were aware that this sort of capability was available to them, then they would more readily use it. And I think in the modern day and age, we're in the age of digital transformation and automation, and people, I think a lot of people realize that implementing these sort of automated processes now is actually incredibly easy. So to integrate this process would not be difficult at all. Again, it could be something that can be done via API, and that's what fintech's gravy is, right? That's their bread and butter, building simple RESTful API integrations. So there is no reason at all why once the value proposition, let's say, has been correctly painted, has been correctly drawn out, that that this couldn't be adopted and used.
So, whose responsibility is it then to drive this forward? Is this something we should look to the public sector for, to the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK or similar bodies globally, or is this something where private sector needs to take the initiative and really lead the charge?
So mixed messages. What you'll hear from lots of people in industry as well, there is, let's say, a lack of pace from at a national level, and they believe that this is something which has to be driven from the private sector. But going back to my previous point, the FCA are starting to look more closely at collaboration, as are other organisations like UK Finance, and there are any number of bodies now who are starting to realise the value of collaboration, because a big part of fintech is the value of collaboration. So it's something that probably was, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, this is something, or maybe 3 years ago, this isn't a conversation that you would ever had, expected to have. But I think, given the change in technology, and the ease of use of technology, and given the increasing amount of cyber attacks that we're seeing, I imagine that before long, it will be something that will be probably adopted at a national level. So, for instance, in Europe, we talked about concentration risk. Now Europe is looking at building common services, so that it's sort of hybrid common services to abstract that concentration risk. So Europe itself would build a fintech capability. It could be that might happen here in the UK. It's unlikely, but it could be. But yeah, I think it's very hard to say who should own it. I think certainly regulators will champion it, but then really the onus is on industry themselves to get together within their different forums and trade bodies and to drive this out. So it's about keeping a conversation, a dialogue going at the level of the forum, the trade body, the UK Finance, the emerging payments, similar organisations.
I agree. I see that that's the path forward that I see, is that from regulatory bodies, we're going to be given a set of controls, right? That expectations that private companies will be required or will be asked to implement. And if you have met these controls or this baseline, that you'll be held. And I don't know the right way to phrase this. I don't want to say not responsible, but be given capabilities by the governments or whatever in the case of an incident.
Great, thank you. And a question now from our audience, from Jack Cooper. Panelists, do you think the COVID pandemic has increased cyber risk, and what can organizations do to prevent the likelihood of falling victim to cyber attack?
It's definitely one for you, Bill, I think.
Okay, yeah, I'll take that. So So I don't necessarily think that it's increased the cybersecurity risks, right? I think that it's changed it, right? When I take a look at the attackers that are leveraging specifically the COVID-19 outbreak, the tools and tactics that they're using are commonplace, you know, things that we've seen in the past. The problem is now, and what I mean by those is we're seeing increased phishing attacks. We're seeing increased, you know, scare tactics. We're seeing the same type of attacks, but the problem is that the you know, the landscape that are potentially vulnerable to this has increased dramatically, right? So if getting your payload to land, you know, whether we be talking about a phishing attack or malware or something, we used to have to spend time in doing a lot more reconnaissance to be able to find a topic that we would expect our target to execute, right? And now with COVID, we have a very good topic that we can expect most of our victims to interact with, right? So you can be very scary with a COVID email, something that is similar, just as simple as, here are the cases of outbreaks in our company, with a link to a spreadsheet, right? That's going to drive clicks, right? And but I don't think that the tactics have changed as a result of this. We're just seeing an increase of a specific topic being targeted is kind of how I've fallen on that one.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Bill. I'd add to that as Bill said, it's the changing risk rather than necessarily increasing. It's changed to focus because of the remote working. We found there's much more of a focus on the people and our people's responsibility and their role in protecting our businesses. Businesses that were particularly those who relied on sophisticated defense, cyber defenses that were focused on a physical office or physical location, have needed to adapt to almost to a zero trust network to protect their endpoints, but ultimately the employee risk and the focus around the cybersecurity and the well-being of the employee, I think is absolutely key there. One question I'd like to ask the panel, leading on from COVID-19, is what should fintechs and financial organizations be thinking about their obligations to the regulators in terms of prioritizing their resources during the pandemic? We've seen the Revenue Office and the VAT Office and various other bits of government offer support by deferring payments, by waiving some payments in order to support businesses and to keep people in work. What can we expect to see from the data protection regulator here when we fast forward in a few months and we uncover data breaches? Does the obligations of companies to the regulators change during this time, or what do you expect to see?
So I have some thoughts there, and I think just we have to recognize that where we're at today, like right now, this is the new normal, right? And we need to be building strategies to make sure that we're doing the things that we need to protect the systems right now. There's not going to be a magical day in the future where we go back to where we were 6 months ago. That time has passed, right? We're going to continue to see remote workforces. We're going to continue to see the adoption of software as a service and faster adoption of cloud first, right? So first of all, we need to state that things are not going to go back to where they were, right? And now from a regulatory nature, you know, I'm not exactly sure what changes we could make there that would be that much different, you know, from a regulatory nature around the data protection expectations that we have from fintech. And Mike, I'm curious if you have any. I'm probably way back in, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts there.
Well, in a way, that you can't slacken off what you've got already, right? So I don't think there's any chance that that there will be any green cards, or sorry, not any green cards, but there'll be any leniency from the regulator, because I think what they'll argue is that you should have had sufficient existing controls in place to maintain your controls throughout that period. So what you should have had in place already should have been good enough. So I certainly don't think there'll be any leniency. I think perhaps one of the big parts of fallout of this will be that there will be, in the next 2 or 3 months, we'll start to see a lot of incidents, and that's not the immediate focus at the moment. The question is, if there are incidents, how much coverage will they get? So part of what the regulator does is punitive, and part of that punitive measure is by publicising where a company has done something wrong. Now, if a company has done something wrong through no fault of its own, but they have, inadvertently created some kind of breach or lapse, then the question is, perhaps the better question is, would the regulator be as keen to make that public knowledge, or would they perhaps take a more lenient view?
Right. Mike, I want to echo, especially in the area of fintech, where we've already prioritized, I know we've mentioned this a couple of times, but we were already based on API integrations. We were already kind of structured in this manner. So I agree. They're really it's really going to come down to those punitive measures that you mentioned. I think.
Yeah. Will you be named and shamed effectively? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from our audience, from Christopher Henderson-Ferre, talking about where the responsibility might sit with regard to encouraging this collaboration. So the question is, do central banks have a role in regulating the cybersecurity of fintechs licensed to operate in their territories? Could they, the central banks, act as a central collaboration for a country?
So I think it tends, so the regulation tends to be more pushed out to what's known as the national competent authority, which is the regulator. So in terms of the day-to-day execution of policy, then that's delegated out to the national competent authority. But what I do think is that the central bank can stimulate collaboration conversations using stimulating measures. Obviously, it just needs a bit of thought as to how that works. So how, from an economic perspective, how do you encourage collaboration? Do you pass on economic benefits to companies that participate in that collaboration? So in other words, do you encourage it via financial incentivization? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where the right central location needs to be. I think you guys probably have a better sense on that, but there does need to be some centralization just to define these are the expectations of what we're sharing. These are the expectations of what you'll be doing with what's shared. So one thing that I find commonly skipped is even acknowledging the fact that this didn't occur in my environment when something's shared, right? That's just as valuable as if it had, right? So you can start to understand from a threat intelligence perspective, acceleration through through verticals. You can see is this a spray and pray, or is this targeted? You can start to understand who's next, right? You can start to understand commonalities across those attacks, those kind of things. So just defining what needs to be shared and how the expectation around the use of that data is important. And that kind of needs to come from a centralized location.
Yeah, thank you. And a question from Paul, which sort of neatly dovetails into what you were saying there, Bill, is do you see the benefit, therefore, in having a consortium threat intelligence data from across any particular industry? And I would like to add to that question, that's the original question, but also just to reiterate for those joining us today, why the panel thinks it's important, not specifically just that question around threat intelligence consortium, but why the collaboration is important across the industry.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that, and then I'll hand it over to you, Mike. But so absolutely, I do see just almost essential benefit of having consortium of threat intelligence across specific industries, right? So verticals need to have their own threat intelligence sharing platforms, and those need to be connected together as well, right? So when we start talking about supply chain, whether we're talking about fintech, just consider the amount of industries that finance impacts, right? All of them, right? And so an attack on fintech specifically could be targeting our peers, right? Or it could be as a part of a campaign going after another vertical, perhaps going after using fintech as a supply chain attack, going after perhaps national defense or energy, or some of the other critical infrastructure sectors, right? And so when I think about your last point, and then Mike, I'll turn it over to you. But the why do we need to collaborate? I just to put it simply, to me, it's the way that it's the way that we can win as an industry. It's how we need to do this. If I can tell you that, hey, I just experienced a breach, the attacker was after an externally facing remote desktop protocol service. Once they were on there, they installed PowerShell, and then they did this. Mike, if I tell you that, your first actions are going to be, do I have any remote desktop protocol servers running out there, right? And protect those first, right? So this is the only way that we're going to be able to get ahead of attacks, is to be able to share, here's what's occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting around that zero-sum game attitude, where your loss is seen as my win, because it simply doesn't work like that. Because the danger is that in creating in perpetuating, let's say, an adversarial competitive environment, then you actually threaten yourself, because the same threat that you withhold from sharing to your peer group, the obvious point is that they'll be withholding from sharing those threats with you in that zero-sum game environment.
Yes, and I think it's what, if I understand that correctly, if I hear that correctly, is we're saying that companies need to collaborate in their vertical and wider than that, in the first instance, to be able to keep up and compete with the attackers that are collaborating already in attacks and launching attacks against us. But then that effective collaboration at the right speed and the right information, right integration, can actually help us get ahead of the bad actors and actually provide additional maturity and protection of our businesses. I've heard some people actually liken this to the airline radar system, which is publicly available to all authorized sources. They can see activity, but you don't get to know what's on the plane or who the passengers are or what the cargo is. But we can see the vital information that we need in order to keep our airspace safe. So I think that's quite a useful one to think about. I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today. Today, to summarize, was all about why the need for collaboration. So if for our participants who feel they still have more questions about how they could do it, or what practical steps they could take, or where they could go, that'll be our next installment in the series, which is scheduled for 15th of July. So please tune in for that. We will go much more into how the collaboration could happen, and make it really practical for organizations. I mentioned during the session the National Cybersecurity platform called CISP. This is an information sharing platform that's available to all UK companies across all verticals. If anybody's interested in that, please contact the ITC team. You need to be referred into the program. but there's no charge, and the ITC team can help and support you with that. The other ITC event I would like just to mention is part of our responsibility as a cybersecurity advisory business and a managed security service business is to lead some of this collaboration. We have now, for the past 3 years, been leading the Retail Fraud Prevention Forum, which is a forum for UK retail businesses co-founded by ITC and Tesco. And it is chaired by Matt Lawrence from Tesco, who is the head of threat and vulnerability there, which was originally focused on helping retail businesses with fraud that they were seeing from their loyalty card programs. But we found that by bringing these big retailers together and getting to talk about their common issues, their challenges, beyond sharing technical data, just case studies on challenges they've had, they've been able to build strong bonds in that retail space and in the retail sector to build a better defense against cyber attacks and fraud as well. So that's happening on the 7th of July. So if anyone in retail is interested or know anyone in retail, please do refer them to the ITC team as well. But for today, for our collaboration series, I'd like to thank our panelists, Bill and Mike. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much for all the participants, and we'll see you on the 15th of July. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.